Hi everybody, welcome back to class. It's Jessica Grelanda here. So you might want to look at this lecture today as part one of two parts. Today we are looking at political parties in the lead up to next week where we will explore the electoral system. But I think it's important to spend some time on understanding why we have political parties and what are their benefits, but also what are their drawbacks. Now, I don't know if you know this, but we don't actually vote for political parties at all levels of government. We do vote for them at the federal level, and we do vote for them at the provincial level, but we don't vote for political parties at the municipal level. We also don't vote for political parties in the territories. So in Nunavut, for instance, you would choose the person you thought would best represent you, and that person would join the others, and together they would make decisions about how to guide the future of that territory. So that's what we're going to look at today, but first, a definition of political parties. So for the purposes of this class, let's work with this definition of a political party. It's an organization that's designed to obtain the power of the state and perhaps, but not necessarily, form a government. So this applies to our major parties in Canada, for instance. However, it is important to note that there are some exceptions to this definition. What you see here is a list of all the political parties that ran in the 2019 federal election. Now, you might notice that there are a lot more than you're used to seeing on lawn signs, and that's because there aren't only political parties that run with the goal of forming a government or becoming part of the government. There's also a whole host of parties that use the election time and the publicity that it brings to highlight typically one major issue that they care about. So for instance, if you look at this list, we have the Animal Alliance Party, and this party mainly concerns itself with animal rights. We also see on this party list the Rhinoceros Party. Now, this is a resurgence of an old party in Canada whose goal is fairly absurd. They bring a level of satire to the government. So I'm going to show you actually a clip of a rhino candidate describing his platform. The clip is a little bit hard to understand, but I think it's worth it. It comes from the 80s, so have a listen to this very unusual candidate.
Campaign Director Charlie McKenzie.
Good evening, my fellow Canadians and mes chers amis Nordiques. Thank you for inviting me into your homes this evening to deliver this very important address to the nation. Here it is. Recently, the Party Rhinoceros commissioned me to chair the Ronald McDonald Task Force with a mandate to pose 3 vital questions to our 1.3 million young unemployed people, the yuppies. Should we repeal the law of gravity? Should sex, drugs, and rock and roll be developed as natural resources? And last, but certainly not least, do they have any spare change?
So that video that we just saw is of a political party, the Rhinoceros political party, but clearly that party has no real intent of obtaining power and forming a government. So typically speaking, in Canada, we tend to have approximately 5 political parties that are actually vying to be part of the government, whether to be the leadership of the government or to be a part of the formation of the government. Now, this tends to land somewhere in the middle when we look at it from a global perspective. So there are, on the other extremes, in some cases, there are one-party states where there is only one party to pick from. So you can imagine it doesn't make for a very robust election process when there are no other viable options. And now on the other end of that, we have some countries that have very many political parties, very many viable political parties that are actually trying to obtain that power of the state. And what tends to happen is these parties, because none of them can take a majority of the votes on their own, these parties have to form coalitions. And these coalitions of various parties tend to be the leadership of the countries. But one of the issues there is these coalitions tend to be fairly fractious, right? They tend to fall apart fairly easily. So often what happens in these coalition-style governments is that many different elections have to be called because of infighting between these political parties. So Canada tends to sit at a fairly stable middle in between those two ends of that spectrum. So in recent history, as I mentioned before, we typically have about 5 parties that are genuinely vying to become members of government. Some of these are much more successful than others. In fact, you may note that there is one political party that ran in the 2019 federal election not cited here, and that's the People's Party of Canada, which was an offshoot of the Conservative Party. So its leader defected from the Conservative Party and created his own party. I did not list it here, although it managed to run a full slate of candidates. That means it had candidates running all across the country, and that allowed the People's Party to participate in the televised leadership debates. The People's Party of Canada did not win any seats in the federal election. Even its leader did not win his seat. So we'll move along to the other parties. The Conservatives and the Liberals, at least at the federal level, have so far been the only parties historically to gain the most seats and therefore form the leadership of the government. But that doesn't mean that the other parties listed here don't play an important role. So, for instance, the Bloc Québécois is a bit of an outlier because although it is a federal political party, its interests are simply to protect the interests of Quebec, and at various times its interests have been to actually separate Quebec from Canada. So it's a bit of an odd example. The Greens, and particularly the NDP, get to play a very interesting role, especially in minority governments, and we'll talk about that next week, in that what they tend to do is play a role called power brokers, where they will lend their support to one of the main political parties, typically the party in charge, in order to form enough seats collectively, or form enough votes, I should say, collectively, to get a law passed. So what they'll do is they'll say, if you do this for us, we will support your government in its agenda. And the NDP especially has played this role quite adeptly in the past. When we talked about the idea of Canada as a nation, we talked about the things that divide us and the things that unite us. And one of the things that unites us is our traditions, a general sense of values. But one of the things that tends to divide us is our political attitudes. And what I'm talking about in this case can also be coined as left-wing ideas versus right-wing ideas. So, of course, there is a spectrum of political attitudes and ideas. People who are on the left wing tend to feel that we need more government to step up and pass laws that will make our lives in some way better or safer. So, for instance, someone who is left-wing would typically believe in universal health care and subsidized daycare and free tuition for students. The left wing also has an emphasis on fairness and equality, a belief that government should and can help to level the playing field so that everybody has an equal chance. So for instance, someone who's left wing would likely think that if you have 2 equally qualified candidates in a male-dominated field, that the woman, for instance, should get the job, or that the richer among us should pay a little bit more in taxes to fund the system than those who are poorer. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, what we call the right wing, there's a caution there that says, you know, you shouldn't so easily give away your power to the state, give away our individual abilities to make decisions about how we want to live our own lives. And they would often call a government that intercedes in the lives of people and passes a whole bunch of laws to try to make our lives better a nanny state. So like we have a babysitter who needs to watch over us. So for instance, people who are in the right wing might say that programs like free healthcare and free university and free college are not free. They still cost money. It's just that the taxpayers have to pay for them. And they would say that, or it would be a common theme, that people feel that they will manage their own money much more carefully than if a government takes our taxes and manages our money, so that we know best how to spend our own money. Furthermore, right-wingers would likely argue that they've worked hard to make their money and they shouldn't have to pay more for services that everybody gets access to. And if they want to pay a little bit extra for, better healthcare or better education or better daycare, they should be allowed to do that. So those tend to be some of the major ideas on either end of that political spectrum. So where do our top 3 political parties tend to lie on that political spectrum? Well, classically speaking, these parties do shift depending on their membership and their leadership, but typically speaking, the New Democratic Party tends to be a more left-wing government or a left-wing party, whereas the Conservative Party tends to occupy more right-wing attitudes. That leaves the Liberals. Typically, they're called centrists. So typically speaking, they tend to occupy more of a middle ground than the other 2 parties. But before we move away and start talking about elections and how elections work, I think we should address a more basic question, which is, why do we have political parties in the first place? Municipal government doesn't need them. The territories don't use them. Why not just get rid of political parties altogether? There are a lot of really serious issues related to having political parties. So, what's wrong with partisan politics? That means party politics. Well, for one thing, as a member of a political party, you are expected to follow the party line. That means that if your party leader believes something or plans to pass some sort of law that you disagree with, you can't publicly contradict that or vote against your party. There was an interesting example that came up in the early 2000s where a prominent female businesswoman named Belinda Stronach joined the Conservative Party. And she was seen as somebody who could have one day become a female prime minister. However, she could not agree with her party's position that men should not be able to marry men and that women should not be able to marry women. So much so that she finally left the Conservative Party. So there's just very little to no room for minority views within a party because parties brand themselves based off of their platforms. So a platform is a short series of ideas that makes up the vision of the party, and all the people who are members of that party need to follow that vision. This is the model of governing that we adopted from England and we continue to follow. And at its very basic form, it's considered to be an adversarial system. So what that means is that it's built into the system that these parties are meant to disagree with each other wherever possible. It's not a very collaborative system, and that's another thing that can be an issue. If you've ever seen Question Period, that's the House of Commons when the parties are arguing, it can look quite childish actually, because it looks like members from opposing parties are looking for whatever opportunities to dismiss the ideas of the other party. So those are some problems with the political party system. So as I mentioned, why do we have them? I think the short answer to that question is that it would be chaos without them. Yes, municipalities and territories manage without political parties, but that's because they're small and they have smaller populations. So it's not such a big deal for people to figure out what Bob or Jagmeet or Jackie wants to do if they get voted into government. Can you imagine at the federal level, we have over 300 members of parliament. If we had to do research on every single individual and what their background was and what they would do when they got into office, people simply wouldn't do it. Political parties spend millions of dollars educating us about what the issues are, about problems with the other parties, and about what they would do if they were to form the leadership of the government. They even actually have, thousands of volunteers who make sure that we're signed up to vote, and even in some cases drive people to the polls if they can't get there on their own. Now picture the first day of a new parliamentary session where you have over 300 new Bobs and Jagmeets and Jackies who walk into Parliament to form some kind of government. They all have different ideas. They don't have an infrastructure behind them. They'd all have to hire their own staff. Political parties have that infrastructure that's pre-existing. They have lawyers and bureaucrats, and they are prepared to form a government when that day comes. Political parties have conventions where their members get to decide who's going to be the leader of that party. They create party platforms, as I mentioned, so broad ideas about what they believe and what they'll do. And more importantly, they can easily be held accountable by other political parties if they don't do what they promised they would, or if they're going to do something that might be seen as unsavory to the Canadian public. Now, having said all that about political parties, the good and the bad, and why we need them, and where we don't have them, I'd like to completely contradict myself to end off and say that yes, it is possible to run for office in this country at a provincial and at a federal level without being part of a political party. Those people, although quite rare, run as independents. So they are independent candidates not affiliated to a political party. The woman you see pictured here is called Jody Wilson-Raybould. You may have heard of her. She is actually quite a hero to some people. She was a member of the Liberal Party, an elected member of the Liberal Party. In fact, she was part of Justin Trudeau's cabinet. She was his Minister of Justice and his Attorney General. And due to what she felt and was further substantiated as corruption within that government, she left office and she left her party. And she ran in the 2019 election as an independent candidate. And she won. So I'd like to leave you with a little bit of her story. Next week, we'll talk about political parties a little bit more, but within the context of how the electoral system works. So have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week.
Vancouver, British Columbia, the home of Jody Wilson-Raybould, Canada's first Indigenous Attorney General. It's her story that brought us to the West Coast. Over the past 2 months, Jody Wilson-Raybould's refusal to cave to alleged political interference in the justice system has dominated the headlines. Wilson-Raybould was a rising star in Trudeau's cabinet, but now she sits outside caucus, kicked out by the Prime Minister himself, after she pushed back against alleged pressure to use a deferred prosecution agreement to help SNC-Lavalin get a deal in a high-profile criminal case. In January, Wilson-Raybould was demoted to Veterans Affairs, which she says is because she would not intervene. Since then, she's quit cabinet and promised to tell her truth. In late February, she appeared before the Justice Committee and did just that. Since the story broke on February 7th, 2 high-profile resignations in the Trudeau government. Principal Secretary Gerald Butts resigned, and so has the Clerk of the Privy Council. The Liberals shut down further hearings at the Justice Committee, but that didn't stop Wilson-Raybould, who submitted further evidence, including this now notorious recorded call with the Clerk of the Privy Council.
Because I think he feels the government has to have done everything it can before we lose 9,000 jobs in a signature Canadian firm.
Right. So, I'm confident in where I'm at, and my views on SNC and the DPA haven't changed. This is a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence that, Michael, I have to say, including this conversation, previous conversations that I've had with the Prime Minister and many other people around it, it's entirely inappropriate, and it is political interference.